everybody, Michelle Paschali. I would say massive mental health advocate, really excited to be here, and I'm very grateful to be able to have this platform to talk about such a topic as mental health and well-being. Interesting facts, I've never tried tea before. People always find that super weird. I don't like the smell of it. Yeah, over to you, Rob.
Thanks. I have tried tea quite a lot. So I'm Rob, I'm from Workable, but not work stuff. So I have 2 kids, 5 and 7, 2 boys. I work, I like boats, I like the sea, I like the seaside, I like going on long walks with Chad especially. But really here to talk about mental health. Which is something I care a lot about. I think everyone cares a lot about. And I think, as Julie mentioned, it's something that recently has become more okay to talk about. And I think it's been a tough few years for everyone, right? Grief, loss, and mental health has been a huge part of that. And the conversation has started to become much more common. So it's okay now to say I'm not okay. And businesses are starting to prioritize it as well. So I think we've moved forward a lot. I don't think we'd be having this session 3 or 4 years ago at an event like this. So I think we've moved on a lot just that we're talking about it. And so at Workable, beginning of this year, we ran a survey, so 1,300 respondents, really about mental health in the workplace. Who's doing anything about it? How do people feel about it? How are you doing? Because we felt that it was something that we were talking a lot about. We wanted to understand in a bit more detail. So we're going to go through some of the key findings of that, but also what I'm really excited to have Michelle here, who's much more of an expert on this space than I am. I'm interested, but I'm not an expert, to really understand, okay, what were these findings, but then go a bit deeper and see, like, why is that? Like, why was that the outcome of the survey? And then also, what can we be doing as HR professionals to move that conversation forward? However you think is right for your company, but what are some of the steps you could take? So that's what we're here to do. Michelle, this is now the non-Twitter bio intro piece where you can talk about work and what you do and what Unmind do.
Yeah, cool. So hi, everybody. I am the head of talent for Unmind. Those that don't know Unmind, so it's a mental health and well-being platform that drives cultural change with the clients that we work with. So essentially, it's an app that allows your employees to be able to proactively measure and track their mental health and well-being through breathing exercises, meditation, self-guided tools to understand more about anxiety, stress, insomnia, and then obviously it allows employers to then have access to the Unmind Index, which is all science-backed insights to really pulse check on your employees' mental health and well-being. And from a personal perspective, very big advocate for mental health, you know, my own lived experiences, and, you know, anything that I can do that relates to that and my values around that, and I'm really looking forward to kind of having this conversation here today to talk a little bit more about how we can start to think of shaping our mental health and well-being strategies at work.
Cool. So very quick intro. So I am Rob, I'm the CHRO at Workable. This is my first HR job. My background is sort of 10 years in go-to-market, so I'm learning a lot about HR as we go. So yeah, happy to be surrounded by people who know much more about this than I do. And I think the first place to start in the survey is really to understand, like, in the survey, over 90% of the respondents, so over 1,000 of those respondents said they have or had mental health challenges before that have impacted them at work. So this is really something that touches on almost everybody. Like, in this room, the vast majority of people here would probably have said yes to that question. So this isn't a niche issue. It's something that's affecting a lot of people and a lot of people at your companies. But also, of those 90%, 40% say they don't want to bring it up. They don't want to discuss this at work. They don't want to bring it up. And the main reason for that was the stigma around it. So although we have started talking about it generally, perhaps people aren't that comfortable about actually bringing it up at work because of that stigma. But also, they said, because of a fear of discrimination, that if they bring it up, it's actually going to jeopardize them at work. And then another third said it's not actually clear what support, if any, there is from their employer. So I think if the main goal now, Michelle, is to sort of just start this conversation, we're like at the beginning of this road, how does an employer do that? How do they reduce that stigma around talking about it?
Yeah, I think, you know, they're really striking statistics to hear, and I know I've definitely kind of felt in that bucket before of like, oh, if I speak up, you know, it's a very lonely place to be, and it definitely takes proactivity from the employer to think about how we can start to remove the stigma associated with mental health. The first thing that I would say in terms of how an employer can prioritize that is really understanding that it is a whole organizational approach. It is a cultural change initiative, which can be quite scary to hear. It makes it much more of a complex topic to approach. But if we think about, the roles that we can play and how we can remove that stigma, a big part of that is starting to normalise the conversation around mental health and embedding that as part of the culture. And the way that we can do that as employers is, thinking about our leadership teams, right? They play a really key role in this, and, having them talk openly about their mental health journey, sharing stories, or even just making it really clear to the business around what their stance is on mental health and well-being can make a massive change in terms of embedding and normalising that as part of the culture. So that would be a really good place to kind of start getting that leadership role modelling in place and storytelling to open up that conversation as part of the norm. Then we can look at things such as, I always hear such nice names for them. So whether it's your internal networking groups that are wellbeing champions or your wellbeing guru, whatever the nice names are that you have for that group, they really play a critical role in this as well, in terms of launching those initiatives, keeping the conversation going, and really opening up that environment to be open and honest. So again, whether that's through storytelling initiatives and sharing and just showing your employees that we can talk about this and it's absolutely fine to talk about it, will start to remove that stigma, and that can be really, really powerful. If we also look at our people managers, we know what a critical role they play, and they have those conversations with our employees so often. And if our people managers, if we ask ourselves the question on, are our people managers actually prepared to have these, have we trained them up? Do they know what language to use? Like, this is really key here. So we need to kind of look at that demographic of employees and how we can equip them to have those conversations to also remove the stigma. So I would say they're really key and critical, and anything we can do around psychological safety. So at Unmind, part of our mission that we talk about is that mental health should be universally understood, nurtured and celebrated, and that's how we should be thinking about it. So anything we can do to enhance that psychological safety, Rob, is going to be really important there to provide a very inclusive environment.
And I think, my assumption here is that it's a good thing to talk about, right? I think we both think it is a good thing to talk about, but why is that? Why should this be discussed? Why should we be talking about it at work at all?
Yeah, it's, again, something I feel really grateful that we're on the stage today to be able to shine the light on the conversation around mental health, and it really comes back into that removal of the stigma piece. Let's keep that conversation going. Something we talk about a lot, where I work, is actually we need to reframe that conversation around mental health. It carries the stigma associated to mental ill health, so we need to understand what actually mental health is and what it isn't. And actually, if we think about mental health, we should be seeing it exactly the same as our physical and dental health. And as I'd like to hope that we all kind of proactively would maintain those, it should be the same for our mental health journey as well. So it's really kind of key to think about it in that way, and the more we talk about it, the more we normalise that, and the more we start to understand and educate ourselves on those differences. And what I would say as well with the stigma associated to it and why talking about it is so important is it often comes from that misunderstanding. I can give you a couple of examples here. If you might have a people manager who someone's opened up to them on their team and said, I'm feeling really anxious and really stressed out at the moment, and that people manager might turn around and say, I'm really sorry to hear that, thank you for opening up to me, but we've got a couple of weeks till that deadline, it will be absolutely fine. Or another example is you could have someone opening up to their manager and saying, I am suffering with depression at the moment, and if that manager responds with a response to say, I'm really sorry to hear that, but things will get better, you've just got to hold on, those of us that are trained in the language that we need to be using, these can be counterproductive, they can actually be detrimental, but we know that it doesn't come from malice, it just comes from that misunderstanding where actually in that moment that people manager thinks that they are being empathetic, they think that those comments are helpful. So it's, again, we just have to open up the conversation to really, one, move away from that stigma and open up the conversation, but I think two, to really start to get the understanding across of what mental health is and isn't.
Yeah. I think one thing you mentioned is really interesting there is sort of with the comparisons like physical health, that a lot of people, myself not so included, but they'll go to the gym every day, or they'll go to the gym 2-3 times a week to look after their sort of physical well-being and physical health. It's not just when they get an injury that they go to the doctor and start doing it, they're doing it throughout. Whereas with mental health, I think we're kind of a step behind that, where people will only go and look for help when they get into that very sort of that darker place of depression. It kind of becomes a necessity, whereas actually it is something that you can sort of build up your mental health. So for me personally, that means sort of I go and see a counsellor every other week, which I used to think was kind of something you did when you were ill, but actually it's just something to prepare yourself for when there are difficult times, you can handle them better. And one thing that I found that was interesting was speaking to people in the US, I always used to hear about people having life coaches, and I thought this sounded very corporate and quite kind of high-level, powerful stuff. And then when I was sort of talking to them about kind of going to see a counselor every couple of weeks, they're like, oh, I do something similar with my life coach. And I just kind of realized, oh, that's what a life coach is. Like, that's just going and seeing someone who's going to help you actually deal with the day-to-day better, get you prepared, and actually build up that kind of mental health muscle for when you need it. So it's not kind of waiting until suddenly it becomes like an emergency, but actually building that up. So I think that comparison really resonates for me. Moving on in terms of like where companies are at with this. So one really interesting finding, and I think very positive finding, was that for 9 out of 10 companies, the respondents said mental health was a priority. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were doing a lot about it. It was just something that was sort of front of mind, was really how I sort of took that. And of that 9 out of 10, what we saw was about 2/3 of those people had already made it a priority. So it doesn't mean they're doing a lot, but it's a priority now. And about 1/3 of those people saying, like, we're going to prioritize it going forward, but we maybe haven't done in the past, but we recognize that we want to kind of move forward. So I think for people in that position, it's great when you feel like, okay, great, this is a priority now, let's go. And you've got a blank piece of paper looking at it going, well, how? Like, what do we actually do? Like, it's a priority now, it's top of a list. How can they prioritize mental health? How should they do that?
Yeah, it can definitely seem daunting. And I think, we have to look at it in a way of with that prioritization, looking at kind of digital and non-digital solutions and a kind of holistic approach to how we can support our employees. And you said something really important, and when you were giving your example there, it's preventative care and it's that maintenance piece, and we want to ensure that we are supporting our employees before it gets to that crisis stage. So that's a good way to kind of start to think about how you might want to prioritize. I will come on to data a little bit later as well, around some data points that can be used to help that as well. What we talk about Unmind, and we carried out a similar survey with some HR leaders, and we very much saw what was coming back is that kind of show, don't tell approach, and that kind of way to prioritize. Some of you might be aware of the ISO 45003 standard and framework. For those of you that aren't aware, essentially this was something that was implemented last June, and it's a framework that's put in place to really understand how we can protect mental health in the workplace and reduce psychological risk in the workplace. We do have blog information about it on Mind, but I think, again, as a well-being individual leader trying to push this agenda, it's a good place to start to think about, how can we look at our workplace and that inclusive environment and, job roles and capacity and all these kind of things to protect our employees' mental health and well-being at work. So that's a really good place to start from an educational piece. We can't manage what we don't measure, so that's where we need to, again, understand, where are we in terms of that journey. And thinking about, we know that 1 in 6 employees, if you have an EAP, so employee assistance program in place, they will use that. But how do we get the 6 for 6? And that therefore means that we need to be looking at our wellbeing and mental health strategies and actually reflecting that for all of the demographics of our employees, and it needs to speak to all. So we need to think about how do we make it inclusive. So that, again, is a really interesting place to start. And we may well find that actually that training of the leadership and educating our people managers, again, is a really good place to start. If we feel that we need to look at psychologically safe environments where employees can actually open up and have these conversations, and again we can remove that stigma, we need to then look at how do we create more safe spaces, how do we role model these stories and show that it's a part of our culture to be able to open up and talk about these things. So yeah, there's various different ways we may look to prioritize, but I'd really have a little look at where you are in that journey, and then using that to kind of back up how we drive that approach.
I think one of those things, like we said at the beginning, that sort of mental health being a priority for businesses and for people and being something it's okay to talk about is relatively new. So I don't think, for most companies, and I think the trouble there is that there's not a playbook yet. Like, there's not this is how you do it, follow steps 1 to 10 and you'll have nailed it. And I think that can be daunting for sort of the people and talent leaders who are sort of given the this is your project, like you organize this. And so it can be daunting. It's like, well, am I going to fall into some traps? Like, what are those sort of most common slip-ups that companies make when they try and make this a priority?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think probably what I would say we tend to see, or what I see from peers and clients out in the network, is probably the biggest one is that not understanding it's a whole organisational approach and it's a cultural change initiative. So when it's just stuck on the responsibility of one person or one group, so whether that's the people leader or wellbeing leader, and actually we've got to remember it, we need all to really drive this forward. I would say other things that come to mind there can be seeing it as a bit of a tick box exercise. Unfortunately, that can still be the case where we think let's just implement an EAP, that's all we kind of need to do. Absolutely not. It's ever evolving, and again we need to think about that preventative care and how we're supporting our employees on their mental well-being and mental health journey. Other things, seeing that actually we haven't gone out to our employees to shape that strategy, so actually we're thinking it is a one size fits all, but it isn't. So again, recognizing that, and as we would with an ED&I strategy, involve your focus groups and all of your employees in on that. And I've seen with the best will of companies, launching their, let's say, wellbeing champions again, which is really great. It starts off with really great momentum, but you start to see those things drop off, and it can be tough because those groups of employees are tending to do that on top of their day job. So you kind of need that person to continue driving that as well. So, and you might see leaders that, when leadership maybe aren't brought in, that they'll then start to give up on that conversation. But don't give up. Like, there's so much information that we can, we know 1 in 6 will suffer with mental ill health at work. We know there's a massive cost perspective on businesses from absences, so it's thinking about actually there's so much data to be able to build that business case up with your leadership team. So I'd probably say they're the main things.
And when we look at the flip side of that 9 out of 10 stat, that means that for 1 in 10, mental health isn't a priority for those businesses, which is a nice small number in a good way. But then we know that sort of 33%, so a third of those people who are prioritizing it, don't know where to start. So they're the blank sheets issue, which is actually nearly half of people then who aren't really doing anything. And so if you're one of the sort of HR leaders or talent leaders in that business who's trying to get mental health as a priority and really start doing things, how do you do that? How do you roll that out?
Yeah, and again, if you feel as though you're quite early on in the journey, that can seem really overwhelming, especially if you see, certain companies that are further ahead on these journeys. So I think you need to take it in silo to the business that you're operating in and seeing where you are, looking at how you can be proactive. So again, thinking about how you can support your employees so they don't get to that crisis point. Data is going to be really important to you here, and if you think that you don't have the data, you absolutely do, whether that's from an engagement survey, pulse check-ins, to calls to your EAP, to Glassdoor reviews, as I know many of us from an EVP perspective, I know I've been one of those people refreshing Glassdoor reviews on a daily basis. If you've got even one employee referring to your culture as, they're overworked, they're burned out, it's toxic, you have to take that on face value because that's their perception of working there. So there's so much data we can use to build up what do we need to prioritize. And again, it might come back to, it is that leadership training, it is that language and that understanding, is it training our people managers so they can have those effective conversations? Is it around psychological safety? When you're holding your focus groups with your internal groups internally, are they saying that they don't perhaps feel comfortable to speak up? And if it is, that's signposting you on how do we make our environment more inclusive? And that's where we might start to launch things like the role modeling or the storytelling internally and opening up those safe spaces there. And something that I just want to share that I think Unmind do really well, and it was an absolute game changer for me, was one of our values is grow our minds, so it's very much a learning and development culture. And in my first couple of months, I'd heard about these famous grow your mind sessions that we hold every quarter, and everyone said, they're really amazing and very eye-opening, but they're really to do with some very real and honest topics. And essentially what they are is every quarter, they're completely voluntary, and you don't have to join them, but essentially what it will be is someone in the business will hold a topic. The topic of my first one that I joined was everyone's individual mental health journey, and I was so amazed at those that were role modelling their stories so openly and so in such a raw and honest manner, and we got split out into breakout groups, and I was sitting there thinking like, oh my goodness, I've only met, so-and-so once, or I haven't even met this person. I'm about to open up to them about my personal mental health journey. But I absolutely am, because they've just opened up about it, and I've just heard these incredible, brave, resilient stories, and I found myself opening up about my experience with burnout, my experience of anxiety, my experience of insomnia, and so much more, and imposter syndrome, and all these different things. And I came off the call really actually emotional, but not emotional because I was upset. I was actually emotional at the fact that was the first time I'd ever felt I've been my true authentic self at work. And that was so powerful to me, and it kind of bridged that gap of friendship and colleagues, and I can't explain how powerful that was. And I think that was a really amazing example of, how you can create these open spaces, and it is okay to talk about these things. So yeah, very powerful things that you can prioritize and put in place, but do look at what would work and where you are in your journey as a business.
One thing you mentioned earlier is that sort of the rollout of mental health strategy isn't one size fits all. And I think what's also interesting is that actually people's experience of mental health at work and the conversations that we're having aren't actually one size fits all either. And when we looked into the data from the survey, we actually found that people who identify as a minority actually are more likely to say that the conversations around mental health are getting worse than those who don't identify as a minority. So how do we, as HR professionals, as businesses, how do we explain that imbalance?
Yeah, I think, it makes me want to implore to ask those individuals, what do they mean by that? What is their perception of worse? And I would say, if you do carry out these kind of surveys internally, definitely hold those anonymous focus groups or anonymous surveys to dig into that a little bit deeper. Do they feel that actually the mental health conversation is worse because they feel that there's more stigma associated to it now? Is it that actually they've tried to open up, but unfortunately they felt that conversation with their manager, wasn't an effective or positive conversation? So we'd really want to understand a bit more about that. And I think, if we look at why that might be, there's various different reasons behind that. It could be a case of just the stigma itself, again, that we've already talked about, associated with mental health. They then carry that fear to open up and have that conversation. If they're coming and they identify as part of a minority group, have they faced discrimination on some level before because of their gender, because of their race, because of their ethnicity? We don't know what else that these individuals have dealt with. And then we're talking about adding on top something to do with mental health, where they feel that already carries that stigma. So that in itself can, carry a really, negative cloud on those individuals feeling like they can open up and have those conversations. It could again be down to the fact we haven't trained our people managers to be able to have those conversations. Is it down to the fact that they don't feel that their environment's so psychologically safe to open up, so they can't be their true authentic self at work? So there's many different reasons, and it's very unfortunate, I guess, to see a statistic like that and that they feel that way. So I think a big part of it is, I think about how can we start to better those conversations, how can we open up those conversations a bit more.
And I think as well, looking at those differences between the results, we also see that sort of non-minorities, but also men more than women, aren't comfortable talking about mental health at work. How do we explain that imbalance, and what can we do as employers to improve it? Yeah,
that's definitely data we know that mirrors the research and studies that are out there that we've also looked into at Unmind and other kind of literature that's out there. And with that in mind, again, it could be similar things around the stigma itself that's associated. Could it be to do with societal norms and identities and gender around masculinity associated with the male gender perhaps, and them feeling like if they open up about that it's going to impact that. Again, we know certain cultures and backgrounds don't even talk about mental health because it's seen as taboo or a weakness, so they won't open up about it. So there could be various kind of different things, and I think if we silo the male gender and those that identify as male, unfortunately we know from studies that men can rank lower in terms of life satisfaction because of things like financial burdens. We know that 4 out of 5 suicides will be by men. So it's just a really unfortunate stat to see, but it's not surprising in the fact it mirrors what we know.
One of the things that did surprise me a bit when I looked at the results was these stats, that actually men are more likely to use the company's sort of mental health support services than women, and women are actually more likely to look for that outside, or they're more likely men to look outside for that. What do you think contributes to that? And is there anything we can do to improve it, or is that just fine?
Yeah, it's really interesting, I guess, especially just based off the last question there. I was really intrigued by this result when I was reading through the report. And what I would say in terms of why, again, that might be, I think we'd probably need to look at what services are we kind of offering out in terms of those employers. Again, if we siloed it to our companies and this data came from, our businesses that we work out, really holding those focus groups and anonymous surveys to understand why that is. It may well be that, we know again from literature and studies out there that those that identify as female are more in the know or have more knowledge about, what support is out there for them. So whether it's psychotherapies, and this may well be why that, those individuals that identify as female have said that they, go outside of their employer for the support. And is it that those that are identifying as male here are heavily relying on what their employer gives them because of the fact that, that's all they know and they don't know what's available to them outside of work? Is it something to do with who shaped that wellbeing strategy? And again, for some reason, it's not quite marrying up, or, those that are identifying as female and maybe not seeing that as the most supportive tools for them. So that could be something to think about, even down to the language and how we signpost the support, the solutions and the tools. That can also be, a reason behind that. And I think how we can then improve on that as an employer. I think a big thing here is really us getting across that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. That's so important, like having our employees all play into that strategy, as we would with an ED&I strategy. It's the same. We wouldn't just shape that. One individual wouldn't just shape that strategy, and it should be the same for mental health and well-being as well. And again, are our managers equipped to be having these conversations? Do our employees feel that they can open up and be honest about how they're feeling? And do they feel that there's stigma associated to them perhaps to even use some of these support tools? And, we talk about this internally a lot all the time. Companies will reference them as benefits and perks, and they're not. It's a basic human need in the workplace. So we need to reframe that conversation and that language as well.
I think we're coming up on time, just about. I think we've got 1 minute. So I think, just to sort of finish up, I think, for you, Michelle, what should the key takeaways be here? What are those kind of main tangible actions that people can take tomorrow?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me here is that understanding of it's a whole organisational approach. It is a cultural change initiative. Your leadership's role and responsibility in that, and then being open and honest and being able to share stories to enhance that psychological safety. That's going to be really key. You do have the data, even if you think you don't, so reference your data points, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you, Michelle. That's really
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Let's give it up.
Everyone.